Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm sure additional folks will join us as we move forward. My name is Jim Melamed, and I'm one of the founders of Mediate.com and the current chairman of the board of Mediate.com. I'd like to welcome you to what is the third of 6 scheduled forums that are considering issues of online mediation and the training of mediators online. Today's forum, as you know, focuses on standards, ethics, and new technologies in the world of online mediation. And this is, for me, a particularly satisfying and fascinating forum, because if we look at the pre-existing standards, whether they're training or ethics or the like, those were generally developed in a non-internet world, or at least without a front and center consideration of internet possibilities. And I find that particularly fascinating because today and for the last year plus, the only mediation that really has been taking place and the only mediation training that has really been taking place have been taking place online. And it was really this void in terms of standards and ethics for the online mediation, and not only online mediation, but the training of mediators online, whether the end result is a desired online mediation or face-to-face. There are separate issues of just how vigorous and how innovative we can be with regard to training mediators online. I want to first introduce briefly Colin, who I'm sure all of you know, and also Claire Fowler. Colin, of course, is now the Mediate CEO, and Claire is the Mediate VP, to review just a few technical aspects about the forum.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to have you here. Very, very excited about the forum today. I'm sure many of you are quite experienced with Zoom, but let me just say one thing about translation. We are very fortunate this morning to have Portuguese real-time translation of the forum. And if you would like to access the Portuguese channel, you can click down on the translation interpretation option at the bottom and select Portuguese, and then you will hear the translation in real time. So if you have any questions or concerns about that, please don't hesitate to send me a private chat. Claire, do you want to talk about chat stuff? Why don't I take the initiative to do so? We encourage everybody to post their comments and questions in the chat. If you'd like to just get going with the chat a little bit, please feel free right now to introduce yourself in the chat. Just say your name and where you're from. You know, one of the great things about doing a forum this way, and we're going to talk about some of the unique aspects of online interaction in terms of mediation training today, but the chat channel is a very powerful dynamic, and we look forward to seeing your questions and comments today. We're going to reserve some time at the end of the session for Q&A, where we can pull out some of the topics that have surfaced in the chat. But if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to post them in the chat. We're also going to save the chat and synthesize and anonymize it, and we will share that as part of in connection with the recording of this session as we move forward, because we find there's a lot of value that can come from that chat. So we will distill and preserve that value. So if you have any thoughts, even not just comments, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat, and it will be archived. Is there anything else that I'm missing, Jim?
Go to the next slide. That'll help us both remember.
Sure, absolutely.
And just, you know, probably the concepts of muting your mic if you're not speaking. That's always helpful with a recording. We do post the recordings of all of the forums. The first 2 are already up. And gosh, I think that's about it. We do take the chat extremely seriously. It's kind of the written record of the forum. And I discovered something is that when you actually print out the chat, it gives you the time code for where the chat comment was made, which is kind of interesting if you want to correlate it with the video. So with that, I would like to next introduce Woody Mostyn, formal name Forrest, but I've known him for over what is it, 30 years now, I think, Woody. And Woody was so generous and gracious as to accept our request to be the chair of the Mediate.com online mediation training task force. And I'll show you a bit more about the structure of the task force in a moment. But I do want to highlight that these forums and the various committee work is hopefully going to come together during June, during which we'll be issuing a report and recommendations in the world of online mediation and online mediation training. And then we'll see what happens from there. Woody, your thoughts?
Thank you, Jim. When we started to vision this task force, one of our dreams was to take what online has become and make it even more accessible throughout the world. And quite often, the field of mediation and mediation training had been very North American centric. And to see so many people from the various parts of the globe is quite heartening. And so any of you who are from other countries who haven't signed into the chat, please do so, because we want that to be a foundation for the work after the task force report is completed in the next month or month and a half. This is a very exciting forum. The speakers are world-class authorities on the subject of ethics, standards, and technology. But I want to, for a moment, support what Jim is saying about how standards in mediation came about originally. There was nothing that had to do with online. When we say originally, we're talking way back into the 70s and 80s. That's long time history in mediation world. And in those days, mediators essentially were self-appointed. And they, by and large, did a pretty good job of self-appointing themselves. And we had pioneers like Gary Friedman and Ken Cloak and Howard Bellman and Lawrence Susskind. And I'm reading some of the names, by the way, from that wonderful book, When Talk Works, by Deborah Kolb, which still has a lot to teach us all. And standards followed the work of these pioneers and were developed first organically, and then various organizations began to look at developing standards. The ABA took a major role in mediating various organizations to come up with standards. And the standards that were developed, the model standards for family and divorce mediation that were developed through the combination of the ABA and AFCC were the state of the art. In fact, I would tell my trainees, if you have nothing else to show new clients, send them the standards. Tell them these are the best practices and the goals that I strive to meet. And there was nothing there about online. And so history kind of doesn't repeat itself as much as moves on to the next level, in that in the online world, we have experts like Colin Rule and Susan Guthrie and the whole group, many who are here, who have individually self-appointed themselves as being able to study, understand, and practice online dispute resolution. And standards have been evolving, and this is a forum where we can put those pioneers, the best practices, and the standards which are in flux, and have two major goals. One should be part of every training, whether that is either online or in person, to teach people what the standards are, to at least have a knowledge that they exist for online work, and also in online trainings to be able to inform their values, their goals, and their best practices of training from the standards that are currently in place. This is going to be a treat, and Jim, I'll turn it back to you so that we can get started.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Woody, for all your work on the task force. Hey, Colin, would you throw that PDF up one more time, and you could go to the next slide if you'd be so kind?
You betcha.
Okay. Is that the next slide?
I think so.
I think that, yeah, okay. So I just want everybody to see how good looking the hosts and panelists are today, and then we'll be throwing it to them in just a couple minutes. Next slide, good. So there you see the URL for the task force generally. As I mentioned, we're trying to come up with a report and recommendations by July. I anticipate we'll do a forum focused on that report itself. You can there see and also link to the various members of the executive committee. And Colin, if you'd be so kind, the next slide. And we also have a large advisory board that's been extremely helpful, serving on committees, helping out with these forums and the like. And again, those names all link. If you'd move to the next slide, please. We've got 11 operative committees that are doing great work and will each contribute to our ultimate report and recommendations. One more slide. And then here's the forum schedule. As you can see, 2 are already completed and recorded and posted, and I'm sure you can find them easily. Today is the forum on standards, ethics, and new technologies. Note also next Friday, the forum on experiential training, mentoring, and case consultation, which I know is going to be exceptional. So we look forward to that, as well as the additional forums. And if you're here, you will be informed about all of these forums, unless you tell us not to. Next slide, please. So here's my big questions, and I'm really kind of where does the rubber meet the road kind of guy. So what I wonder about is whether there is in fact now a coalescing online mediation curriculum. My view is every case is now an online case to at least some extent. And even if you're going to meet with the folks physically, don't you want to do all the online as well as you can do it? And so I wonder, knowing that training standards and ethical standards, et cetera, did not include online considerations, I wonder, what is this new curriculum? And strategically, while I think the online is relevant to each and every discussion, I'm not particularly attracted trying to change 30 and 40-hour training standards that are in regulations and statutes and all those things. I think we probably want to build upon that existent, if you will, face-to-face training. But however we deliver it, what is the new online curriculum that every mediator really should know? How do we define it? How do we implement it, et cetera? Next, how can we most effectively train mediators online? Just as a quick illustration, the ability to go into breakouts quickly, efficiently, without folks even hanging out at the snack table, and being able to recapture them in a moment. Notably, the ability to record participants and give them laser beam feedback and the like, the ability to consult, to have mentorships, and the like. I believe we really need to rethink how can we best train mediators and how can we best train them online. And this is not only for online mediators, this is for all mediators. Because to the extent we're doing it online, it's kind of like anybody on planet Earth can access the world's best trainings and educate themselves. Next question for me is, could an online mediator for today and tomorrow coming into the field achieve all of their training requirements online? Do they still need to get on airplanes and go to big cities and get hotel rooms and take 5-day trainings? Or might it be that the delivery can, in fact, effectively be online? And to the extent that's true, how much of that online training should be live with true real-time interactivity, and how much might be recorded? And of course, how much is one-time training, and what about ongoing continuing education and the like? So these are some of the ultimate issues that I'm trying to figure out. And Colin, if you'd be so kind as to go to the next slide. That's it. So we're ready. And I think I'm tossing to you, Colin, and you'll go ahead and get your panel going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim. Very excited about this today. I think we should just jump right in, and we're kicking off with one of my best friends and closest collaborators in the online dispute resolution field, Professor Leah Wing, co-director of the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. When I did my first campus mediation training back in the early 90s, I went to UMass, and that was when I first met Leah. So we've been friends for a very, very long time. And I will say, all the foundation that all of the work that we've done in online mediation, in ethical principles, ethical standards, comes from Leah's scholarship and her deep, deep well of experience in the field. So I think it's perfectly appropriate that we will begin with her. So Leah, let me hand it to you.
Thank you, Colin, for that overly kind introduction. I really appreciate being on a panel, such a distinguished panel with my friends and colleagues. Let me say one thing that I'm struck by. I am heavily involved in thinking about online dispute resolution ethics, but I also was on the board of the Association for Conflict Resolution at the time that the ACR, the American Arbitration Association, and the American Bar Association worked hard for a number of years in thinking about qualifications and certification, and then came up with model standards for mediators. And so I want to echo Woody's point about this has been an ongoing journey for many generations. But also, I think, I guess I'd like to offer my own personal opinion that I think that there's a very important tension to recognize between needing to hold ourselves and each other and to be held accountable, especially when we add technology to the mix and artificial intelligence to the mix. And so how do we hold ourselves and each other and to be held accountable? And also, whenever we create standards, I don't just mean our field, I mean the field in general, we create gates about who can enter. And I think about every imam, every preacher, priest, grandmother, and so many other community leaders, every rabbi, every dean of students from their perspective at least, right? Are solving problems, helping heal relationships, hopefully meting out justice, and we don't certify them as mediators or arbitrators. And yet youth leaders, etc., healthcare workers are solving problems all the time. So what do we do about this really important tension to create standards, rules, guidelines, best practices, because we want our best thinking. We want to hold ourselves and each other to this high standard. And at the same time, not create all these gates that end up reflecting where power is. So as a white person from the US, I will just say that I think that the field gets framed in the mirror of the white US culture. And so I think that where power travels, that's where standards travel. So I invite all of us to push back on that, because standards may need to reflect cultural paradigms that are different in different places, just like they need to reflect different legal jurisdictions as well. And then we have the challenge of what do we do when we mediate across cultural and legal jurisdictions. So I invite you to think about this. And in the middle of our thinking, we're doers also. So we're developing standards, we're developing best practice. And so again, I invite you on this journey so that we can figure out how we deal with that important tension. And I look forward to hearing your points of view on this. So I'll shift to screen sharing. And say that I'm going to focus on ethical standards as well as guidance, and try to make some translation between that and specifically thinking about when we train online. So I have a couple slides that I invite you to consider these questions if you train online. But I think many of them are relevant for training offline as well. So what are some of the common and challenging ethical dilemmas that you can include, or that, excuse me, that arise when you include technology in mediation? How can you best harness the benefits of actually training online to explore tech's impact on mediating? So in the process of training online, we have lots of opportunity to use these as teachable moments. And what about the new risks that get raised when we use technology in mediation or online dispute resolution? How is it best to incorporate ethics training to help mediators prepare to address them? So for example, let me just give you one example. If mediators are going to be mediating online, do they have a responsibility for preparing all the disputants to understand both what technologies are going to be used and how to access them well? Should the mediator be responsible for training up the participants? And what happens if one party has a more difficult time than the other during the process? Should the mediator be the tech consultant? And if not, who should be? Or do mediators not need to worry about this? That's just one small example of a question that we'll need to think about when we relate ethics to practice. What might be the benefits of incorporating mediation ethics throughout an entire training rather than as a discrete, isolated component? How can we best stay current on ethical standards and best practices, particularly regarding online dispute resolution? And the reason I raise that is that tech is changing fast, and it's changing faster than we can even develop standards and best guidance, let alone alter them when new tech arrives. What standards exist in the jurisdictions in which your trainees will mediate? And if they use technology to mediate, what standards exist across jurisdictions that are relevant? What roles, I'm particularly interested in this, what roles can ethical principles play when there are no standards? Or there are no up-to-date standards. Many of the standards, almost all of our ADR standards, which I'll talk about more later, do not incorporate technology. So can we use a set of ethical principles to think about handling ethical dilemmas in the absence of standards? How does the use of technology increase or decrease our ethical, legal, and practical challenges for not just mediators, but mediation programs? Very often when we focus on training, we're focusing on training mediators. And in my experience, very often those that coordinate and administrate programs are maybe not even mediators. So what standards are needed for mediation programs, especially when we add the ethical challenges that come with technology? What ethical guidance, risks, and needs should influence the selection of software tools and platforms? For example, case management, e-calendars, video conferencing, our collaborative writing tools, But also, if we think about how many mediators get referrals from courts or mediation programs are funded by courts. So if we start to mediate online, if they're holding hearings online, and we start integrating our systems through technology, what ethical guidance do we need to consider? What work do you need to do as a trainer to integrate diversity, equity, and accessibility into your training? This is both regarding technology and regarding other issues as well. So I think that for many of us, it's obvious that there's an interest in including ethics, that it's important, but I wanted to highlight several things that many of us who are working on this have thought about. I do a shout out to my colleague from the Ministry of Justice in Canada, Amelia Pesh, who has worked with me on co-creating this list and gave me permission to share with you. Mediators and mediation program coordinators have tremendous discretion in how they do intakes, how they do referrals, what information they give to prospective disputants, how they set up mediation interventions, whether technology is used. And this has a meaningful impact on the process and therefore, I would argue, potentially on the outcome. We have a responsibility to uphold the laws of our jurisdictions as well as the membership requirements of the organizations we belong to. And arguably, we have a responsibility to be aware of the potential ethical dilemmas as well as the values and assumptions that are impacting our thoughts and our actions as mediators. This should be a motivation for us to offer ethics training during our mediation trainings. And especially, I think it's important to recognize that the disputants have very little impact, first of all, on what ethical standards we're making. And I think that that's a challenge for us to consider. When we're developing best practices and ethics, do we reach out to former disputants? Do we reach out to potential disputants and ask for input? They're a key stakeholder. Normally, they have very little input on the way that services are delivered, and therefore the onus for ethical performance should be on the mediators in the programs. And certainly when we add technology, this raises risks and it makes new ethical dilemmas, which too often our guidance and our legislation and our standards don't address. Now, I want, for purposes of trying to help the field gain more clarity, I want to contribute to the discussion about some differences between different kinds of governance and accountability mechanisms. Sometimes the words are used interchangeably, but if you do research on governance, regulation, rules, and ethical principles, for example, across many disciplines, what you'll find is a fairly regular pattern of breaking things into two categories, one being rules-based, like standards or regulation, legislation, and rules, in which case this in effect is the floor. People cannot go below this floor. And we can hold people accountable with potentially punitive action. They can no longer practice under the name of the organization, or they could be sued, or they could be reprimanded, etc. Values and guidance-based tend to be more aspirational or more suggestive. And so I'm going to cover some examples of each of these. So here are some examples that I pulled from membership organizations, national and regional government examples. These are just some examples. There obviously are more of all of these all over the world. There are more of these in private entities as well, in for-profit entities, but I focused on membership organizations and governmental. So you can look at the model standards of conduct for mediators, which I mentioned earlier, that the American Arbitration Association, the American Bar Association, and the Association for Conflict Resolution, which is an international organization, created. And then there are also ACR model standards. The ADRIC, the ADR Institute of Canada, has a model code of conduct for mediators. The Academy of Professional Mediators in the US also has standards. And then the Colin's going to speak in a little while in more depth about this, but the International Council on Online Dispute Resolution, which is the world's first membership organization for online dispute resolution, which includes mediation, has created ODR standards. And we'll, as I said, we'll hear more about this today. And then the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation entity, has created model procedural rules for cross-border business-to-business disputes. And my understanding is that they're engaging and thinking about that from a consumer perspective as well. And then we have exciting new news that the Republic of Colombia is drafting a law on ODR. And I'm sure there are other countries that are doing that as well. Without a doubt, India is at the lead. They, on the national level, the Republic of India has decided to forward online dispute resolution in every ministry. I don't want to speak for that country, but you can search online and see the tremendous national effort that's underway there. And the EU has regulation, and then the US has related laws on the national and the state level as well. So I'm just trying to give you a sense. Again, this is broader than what I'm presenting, especially because there's more happening around the world as well. Now, for principles, guidance, and technical notes. There are a set of ethical principles ACR has put out. There are guidelines for training. This is not for online, it's for in-person by the Academy of Professional Family Mediators in the US. And then my organization, which is actually the name National Center is a misnomer. It's really an international organization. We have 50 fellows from around the world that are folks who've been working on online dispute resolution, many of us for over 20 years now. And we developed a set of ethical principles. I encourage you to take a look at them. They are at odr.info. And they are not standards. They are aspirational, and they have flexibility in their ability to be interpreted in different jurisdictions and different cultures, but they have grounded the application of technology to dispute resolution as the primary focus of consideration regarding ethics. And ICODER, as well as a number of other organizations, certainly when the pandemic started impacting the world as a whole, decided to provide guidance for attaching video to mediating online. The National Center for State Courts in the US and many other organizations have done that as well. So there's great guidance that's already out there. It's not being presented as comprehensive or as best practice yet, but it provides many useful, concrete, practice-oriented suggestions in order to prevent ethics dilemmas or respond to them. And then the United Nations spent at least 7 years working hard to try to come up with an agreed international cross-jurisdictional commitment about e-commerce online dispute resolution. And so far, what they've been able to do is create a one-pager that is a series of technical notes that are a set of suggestions that are agreed internationally. A couple more things before I pass the baton to my colleagues. One is that I would say our ethical considerations and the mechanisms we create for guidance and accountability really need to cover at least these areas. Mediators, as well as our programs, as I said before, and technology. I think we're heading towards a future generation where algorithms will be creating algorithms. What kind of standards do we need, not only for the use of technology in mediation, but regarding the type of technology and whether it can create new technology and still be used? What transparency or what limitations do we need? We also need ethical guidance regarding dispute systems design and integration, especially as we're starting to use technology to integrate our practices with social media. If you're engaging with clients and the best way that they can engage with you is through WhatsApp on a smartphone or some other app, what do we need to have as standards regarding security or privacy, or our agreement to mediate documents ahead of time regarding what technology is used? And then we need standards and best practices regarding training as well. One thing I would like to bring up in particular, as I mentioned, I pointed to before, is that historically, our alternative dispute resolution and mediation in particular standards have not addressed data privacy, security, technological accessibility, transparency about the use of artificial intelligence, including machine learning, and our integration using technology. Now, specifically, these organizations, and they're just some examples, have already endorsed or are considering ODR rules or standards. You could see I have some examples from around the world. Some have done this work 10 years ago, some have done them 3 weeks ago, and there are many more that are coming on board. But they provide useful guidance, especially if we fall under their rubric. And as I start to close, I just want to talk about a particular initiative that a number of us are involved with. The American Bar Association, ICODER, and the National Center are working together on 2 particular projects. One is we are taking the ICODER standards and for online dispute resolution, and we are looking to make them more robust and broader by jurisdiction, by sector of society. And we are also doing a collection of ODR standards worldwide. And we have a public archive at odr.info, the center's website. We encourage you to use that. We also very much welcome that wherever you are in the world, if you become aware of an ODR standard, ODR regulation, ODR best practice, please feel free to email us, and we're happy to post it in its original language. If we eventually get an English version, that's wonderful, but we don't have to begin there. I'd be happy to take questions now and at the end, and also for you to be in touch with me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was great. And I am monitoring the chat, and I haven't seen too many questions, and I'm cognizant of the time. So I'm tempted we just roll over to the next presentation, unless anyone has any specific clarifying questions for Leah.
Colin, could I ask a specific question?
Sure.
And that is, and you may be able to chime in also on this, relative to ICODER's development and the National Center, it's generally been spoken to as ODR, standards and considerations. And ODR, of course, is broader than just mediation, notably including arbitration, blockchain, AI, you name it. And my question is, as we look to have standards that would be consistent with what ICODER is doing and what the National Center is doing, do you think ICODER and the National Center will be issuing, if you will, online mediation standards, or will the analysis keep itself at the ODR more general level? So I'm just trying to figure out who takes the great work that's being done relative to ODR general and translates it specifically down to the world of online mediation.
Well, I'm tempted to put a pin in that question because my slides do address that in my section. But Leah, do you want to speak to that before?
I'm happy to let you jump in on that since you've prepared, and then we can have a further discussion as a larger group if that is needed.
Yeah, I think, and Jim, look, you were the first one who said to me back 20 years ago, if you squint a little bit, it's pretty hard to tell ADR and ODR apart. And so I'm going to address that in my slides, but it's very hard for me to understand the distinction between online mediation training and mediation training online. I think it's all becoming sort of a delicious bouillabaisse. It's difficult to pull all the ingredients apart. So I will address that in my section, especially when it comes to some of the platform and AI questions. But why don't we move? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to actually stop you there from Jan, because we're going to go to Dan's presentation. So let's see. Okay, so I'm going to stop share. And Dan, can I give the conch to you, if I might? Let me just say a word about Dan Rainey, my good friend. I think that Dan is the #1 online mediation trainer in the world. I think Dan has probably trained more online mediators than anyone else I've ever met. And I think if there was anybody else who's done more, I would know. Dan obviously was not only a pioneer in ODR and has done amazing work on ethics and standards alongside Leah for the entire life of the field. But Dan was the chief of staff at the National Mediation Board for many years and has a lot of firsthand experience dealing with complex disputes. But I think Dan is the one who taught the first online dispute resolution class that I know of, and has taught in academic environments. He's taught for mediation professional organizations, and he's led the work for the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution and ICODER on thinking about our training standards and all of these topics. So I think Dan is the perfect person to take the baton from here. So Dan, let me hand it to you.
Thank you very much, Colin. As usual, your introduction is over the top, and I both appreciate
and 100% true
and embarrassed by it. So let me first let me say that what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to try to recap anything that Leah talked about, because the pure fact of the matter is that if you want to find someone who has influenced the discussion about ethics and standards and principles in dispute resolution, be it online or offline, Leah is the leader, period. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to extend some remarks that are related to where she started us, and hopefully will connect us to my colleagues who come afterwards, particularly with Colin's remarks on security and data safety as we go forward. So my goal here is to take a little step sideways and approach things from a slightly different point of view, because I do not want to compete with the best, which is what I would be doing if I tried to replow the ground that Leah just went over. So let me share my screen and start the video. And I'm assuming my screen is up. Can everyone see it?
Yep, great.
Terrific. So I'll leave this up for a second or two. This will be recorded, so if you want to get in touch with me, I'm happy to talk with anyone anytime. I'm not hard to find. That's my email address and my website address. So please, if you have follow-up questions or you want to contact me after we're done today, please feel free to do so. So what I'd like to talk about today, I'd like to frame these around a few questions or areas. First of all, I just want to talk for a moment about why we need standards in the first place. And I also want to talk about why not a standard mediation process as opposed to standards for mediation. And I'll make a distinction between the two. I want to talk a little bit about the IMI certification and e-mediation, because I think it does address to some degree the question that was just sort of thrown out a moment ago by Jim. And then I want to talk a little bit about a project that I'm engaged in now that I had hoped would be a little further along by the time we got together today, but which is unfortunately not going as quickly as I would like for it to go. And then I want to talk a little bit about the issues that are affected by technology. And finally, very quickly talk about what should we address as trainers and what should we look for in training. And so I'm going to sort of organize my thoughts around these major topic areas. And as with Leah, I'm happy to take questions. And I think probably what we decided early on was we would defer those questions to the very end. But if you have something you want to stick in the chat while we're talking, please do so, and we'll try to get to those as we move forward. So starting off with, why do we need standards in the first place? Well, bottom line is we need them to be effective as third parties. I'm going to talk a little bit about the variegated nature of mediation, but there is a thing that we do. And this thing that we do has some boundaries, and there are things that you can do that are effective and things that you can do that are not effective. Now, one of the things that standards and ethics and principles do is they give you the rails in which you ought to be operating, and they guide you toward effective interaction with the parties that you deal with. One of the things that I don't know if it distinguishes me from anybody else or not, but one of the things I believe is that very often we focus too much on the technology when we talk about online dispute resolution, and we lose track of the fact that what we're really talking about is human communication. We're talking about trying to find ways to get human beings to talk when they have trouble talking, and to, if possible, move towards some understanding and possibly resolution of issues. And there are things that are tried and true that help us do that. And there are things that are tried and untrue that get in the way of that. And the notion of standards, ethics, and principles are those rails that tell us where the effective boundaries are. So we need them very much as a field. And in fact, I would argue that we're really not a field without them. We need the standards to avoid doing harm to parties. I mean, there's a reason why the ethical principles that we operate on are focused on dealing with the people who come to us for help. And so we need them to avoid doing harm to parties. And finally, I think we need them to develop a set of common concerns. And I'm going to talk as we go through this about why we're never going to have internationally a common process, but we may have a set of common concerns that we effectuate using the process that we happen to have chosen or that we're trained in. And so it's very important. This whole notion of standards is not just an academic debate. These are things that guide the way we behave. And that's terribly important in terms of how we deal with these human beings who come to us with problems and look to us as people who can help them not necessarily solve the problem, but help them communicate with one another and talk when they're having trouble talking alone. So why not a standard mediation process? I mean, why are we looking for standards and principles and not saying, okay, this is the way you do mediation? Well, I could say it's a mess, but I'm going to be a little kinder than that and say it's because the search for universal standards of mediation is a fool's errand. I'll talk about why in a moment. There are lots of ways that mediation happens, and they're all potentially effective and they're all potentially not effective. But there are many ways that it happens. And so we're not going to, or at least I'm not going to walk off into the morass of creating a standard mediation process that we can say, this is the way you're supposed to do it. I'm more than happy to talk about principles, standards, and ethical guidelines that no matter what process you use, you try to put into effect. But mediation process is another issue altogether. For example, Manon and Jeremy there's a publication that's, I think, in 2012, so it's a few years old now, where they looked at what they call the variegated nature of mediation around the world. And they identified more than 50 different, what they would think of as distinctive ways that one may approach mediation, all of which may be appropriate. And so when you have parties who come from different jurisdictions, there may be different expectations, different styles, and different approaches that vary pretty significantly. And none of them are illegitimate, but all of them could be done with a set of principles or standards or ethics that guide our behavior, no matter what the process. UNCITRAL was mentioned by Leah. There's in their conciliation rules, one of the things that sort of has always stood out to me is saying, okay, do what you think is right, is that the conciliator may conduct conciliation, mediation, et cetera, in a manner that you consider appropriate. And what I consider appropriate in Nigeria may not be the same thing I consider appropriate in Australia. And so there's this notion that the process itself is quite malleable. Even though we tend, by the way, I think in North America to think there is a way to do it. And I could go off for hours on talking about how that's been destructive as we try to institute it around the world without thinking about local guidelines and local concerns. The other thing is the Singapore Convention sets grounds to set aside mediated settlements. And what they say is that you can set them aside if there's a gross violation of mediation or mediator standards. The problem is we don't really have a common notion of what mediation or mediator standards are that are international. We may have some movement toward international understanding of what our ethical principles are and what our standards might be for how we deal with the people who come to us. But the process itself is not universal. So what do you do about that? How do you go about creating the notion of acknowledging expertise, acknowledging the ability to operate effectively in an e-mediation environment? Well, the International Mediation Institute has done some work in this. I was a co-chair of one of their committees. And there are 5 broad areas they identify as things that we ought to be looking at teaching to and using as certification standards for e-mediation. Underneath those 5 broad areas, there are 23 elements. In a moment, I'll give you the link that'll allow you to go and look at all of that in detail. And so what they say is we should look at situational awareness. And that is, when you're approaching parties who come to you to work, what are the parameters that you're operating in? What are their expectations? How do you talk to them about those expectations? Essentially, how do you assess the situation that you're in, and how you fit your use of technology and your use of process into that situation? Do you have basic technical knowledge? And I think in this particular case, and in all the work that I do, what I tell people is you don't have to become a programmer. You don't have to become expert. What you do have to do is you have to educate yourself enough to be able to look at the technology that you want to use, understand the implications of using it, especially when it comes to privacy and confidentiality, but also some other issues as well. And you have to, even though you might not be able to create it, and even though you might not be able to be an expert about how it operates, you need to have a basic understanding of the technology. And so IMI has put into its certification process the idea that you have to show basic technical knowledge. Platform familiarity. If you're going to use a platform, know what it does. Basically operate with it, knowing that, for example, one of the examples that Leah often uses is that if it has tracking software, if it has the ability to track your location, you should know that, and you should reveal that to the parties, and you should be able to turn it off and tell them how to turn it off if that's appropriate. But platform familiarity is one of the areas that is baseline for the IMI certification. Process impact, understanding how the things that you do and the technology that you use actually affect the people that you're working with. And finally, communication with parties. One of the things that I talk about a lot in the work that I do with people is that when you choose technology, what you're choosing is a channel of communication. And that channel of communication that you choose when you choose the technology affects the verbal, nonverbal, and environmental messages that come through that channel. Now, one of the things that you need to understand to be a competent e-mediator, I think, is that you need to understand first what is the impact of the technology on those messages, the verbal, nonverbal, and environmental messages. And how do you compensate for the things that you lose? Just as a very basic example, if I'm operating on the telephone as opposed to on Zoom, I have stripped away all of my visual nonverbal. How do I compensate for that? What do I need to compensate for? What's the impact of that? But just as important for me is, in terms of communication with the parties, how do I use those things that are special about technology that allow me to do things I can't do if I'm operating face to face? Whether that's to create an environment where I can get anonymous input or whatever it might happen to be. How do I take advantage of those things that are unique to communicating using the technology channel that I've chosen? And so these are things that if you want to be certified as an e-mediator through one of the IMI programs, these are the things that they say are baseline bits of information, areas of information that you ought to know about. If you're interested in looking at this in more detail, again, this will be up on the screen when the recording is made. This is the URL for the online mediation specialization program at IMI, and you can also obviously get there by just Googling IMI e-mediation. Pardon me. So to shift gears slightly, this project that I've been working on that sort of addresses this notion of differences in mediation process across international and cultural borders is that we've called it initially the code of disclosure. What should you tell the parties as you begin the process of mediation that would ensure that when they say, yes, I want to work with you, they're doing that with full understanding of what they're getting into, because you've disclosed the elements of the process you're going to use in a way that they can understand and they can accept. Basically, it's an issue of self-determination. Basic problems for international mediation that caused us to think about this is, first of all, many variations of mediation, which I mentioned before. One of the problems here is that parties might not know what to expect. There are parties who enter mediation who are not repeat users, who enter mediation and they say, yes, we're going to go to mediation. They've got no idea what that means. And so their notion of what mediation is based upon what the mediator they've chosen to work with is going to do as process. And so if parties don't know what to expect, I think it's incumbent upon us to let them know what to expect before we actually begin working on their problem. The other sort of side of that coin is that parties come in with expectations. If I'm operating in one area and I'm used to mediation looking a certain way, and the other party in my mediation is from another area and is used to mediation working another way, and my mediator comes from yet another venue, which is relatively common working online, and they have yet another way that they think mediation ought to work, there ought to be some way to rationalize all of that so that everybody who enters into the process enters into it knowingly and enters into it with full self-disclosure or self-determination, sorry. And then finally, there are agreements to mediate are non-standard if they exist at all. I've seen agreements to mediate that are a paragraph long. I've seen agreements to mediate that are several pages long. And so there isn't any standard for those. And in fact, a lot of times in international mediation, there's very little in the way of formal agreement. I have done work internationally with fairly significant cases in terms of money and impact, where we walk in and sit down and nobody's ever talked about the agreement to mediate at all. We just do it. I wish I hadn't done that in the past, but we've done that. And so this whole notion of whether or not you're using an agreement to mediate, and whether that actually touches on all the things that you ought to talk about in a disclosure on the front end of mediation is an open question. So what we try to put together is a code of disclosure, or we also are using the term protocol for disclosure because that seems to be a more neutral way to phrase it, as opposed to a code sounding a little bit legislative. A protocol is just a suggested way of approaching things. And that's what it is. It's a way to suggest a set of items that we ought to talk about as part of the intake and mediation process. It's there to encourage self-determination and hopefully to minimize the impact of cultural and national differences in the approach to mediation process. The code of disclosure, or the protocol of disclosure that we're working on, is not an attempt to create a universal mediation process. The processes are out there, they're legitimate, but what it is trying to do is create an understanding of what you're getting into when you agree to work with certain mediators in a certain venue. Where we are with that project is we're getting input from mediators around the world. And we have groups set up in every continent except Antarctica. And everybody's in except Europe, which is lagging behind. But we've gotten some very interesting feedback. And what we intend to do with the feedback that we get is we want to take all of that, we want to do a draft protocol and distribute that through every dispute resolution group we can get it out to for comment, for further development, and hopefully perhaps for endorsement or for recommendation. And that's hopefully going to happen as we go through this year. We've asked a couple of questions as we put the groups together. One is this a game worth the candle? Should we be doing this at all? And the answer we've gotten back so far seems to be a pretty emphatic yes. That's where the consensus ends. There's a lot of discussion about whether we should be talking about intake or the opening of the mediation process and what should go in to this whole notion of the protocol of disclosure. But there seems to be a consensus that it's worth talking about. And so we'll be talking about it and trying to put something out for people to react to as we move forward. So stay tuned, you'll see more. Very quickly, I just want to talk about issues that get affected by technology and sort of harken back to this notion of training and teaching in an environment where technology is injected into the process, and also how it relates to the idea of standards and who should be paying attention to them. It's my contention, and I don't think it's controversial at all, I think most people would agree with me, that every proposed standard, ethical guideline, principle, whatever word you want to use, that's connected to third-party work is affected when you use information and communication technology. In some way or another, every single one of them is touched by the use of technology. Primarily, in my view, because what we do basically is a process of communication. That's what we do at core. And information and communication technology simply explodes the way we can communicate, explodes the way we can deal with data and information. And even as someone mentioned earlier, it helps us redefine what a group is. So it touches everything, and that's it almost by definition has to touch all of the guidelines, principles, and the standards that we use when we do our work. And one thing I would say that from a training point of view is very important, and that is that technology both is and is not neutral. Technology is neutral to the extent that it'll do what we tell it to do. If we're creating software that is going to cause a problem, the software as it's being created is not going to put its hand up and say, oh, by the way, this is going to cause a discrimination problem. You should not do it this way. The technology does what we tell it to do. I'm sure most people have either heard about or seen the ProPublica evaluation of the Compass software for federal sentencing guidelines and the problems that are caused there. That's not the software's problem, it's the way it was developed that is the problem. Same thing with sentencing algorithms that are used in Virginia. There's a very good article about the fact that judges who ignored the algorithm's recommendations actually wound up being less discriminatory in their sentencing patterns than judges who took the algorithm's recommendations. Again, it's not the technology that did that, it's the way the technology was put together. Because the technology in that sense is neutral. We tell it what to do and how to do it. One of these days, we will be to the point where we're developing software that will make its own decisions. We're not quite there yet. Right now, we do it, and the software does what we tell it to do. It's not neutral in the sense that AI, algorithms, et cetera, have an impact on people based on the values that are baked into them. And so what this tells me is there are two things that ought to be going on when we start talking about training and third-party work. One is that we should be talking to the people that we train and that we teach about these impacts and highlighting to them that they should be giving input to the people who are developing these programs so that we bake in our ethical considerations, our standards, and our principles into the work that we are, into the applications that are being developed. And the other is that we should be going out and talking not just to people who are going to be doing the third-party work. We should be talking to the developers. We should be talking to the programmers, and at least making them aware that there are principles and there are guidelines and there are ethical standards that we want to bake into the products that we use that are technological products. Pardon me. So having said all that, in a nutshell, what should we be looking for? What should we address as trainers and educators, and what should we look for in training if we're looking for training for ourselves or for other people? In addition to the basic mediation process, which may be different depending on where you are, online communication techniques, the whole notion that we are choosing communication channels and we should understand how to use those channels. That should be a part, in my mind, of every third-party training. Ethics and standards of practice, obviously we should be talking about those. Even though there are tons of them and they may differ from venue to venue, we should be talking about them. And actually, there's actually quite a bit of commonality across the international and cultural borders. There's differences, but there's some commonality as well. And finally, not finally, but next to finally, hands-on work with technology. You should be actually putting your hands on the technology and not just talking about how it might affect communication with the parties, but actually putting your hands on it, getting your hands dirty, and finding out how it does do that, and putting yourself in that situation as a real sort of test of how you can operate with the technology. And finally, again, to sort of throw it off to Colin eventually, there should be some assessment of security and privacy. There are many ways to look at this. The way I tend to approach looking at it is with a risk-damage ratio. How risky is the technology I'm using in terms of getting information where it ought not go? And how much damage would be done if that information was inappropriately shared? And if the risk of inadvertent sharing is high and the damage is high, then I should be looking for technology that will lower the risk. And if I can find technology that lowers the risk that is available to me and I don't use it, I think that's ethically unsound. And so this assessment of security and privacy, however you do it, becomes a little bit more fraught when you're talking about technology, and it ought to be a part of the technology training that we do, or the ODR training and the ADR training now that we do for anybody who wants to enter the field. And so that's kind of where I'll leave you. Let me stop sharing. And unless there are any quick questions now, I will kick it back to Colin.
Thank you, Dan. That was excellent. Does anybody have any clarifying comments or questions for Dan? There's a great discussion going in the chat. Thank you for that. We're going to memorialize all of it, but a lot of it's not questions specifically for Dan, so we can surface it again at the Q&A.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Dan.
I didn't say on the front end, which I should have said, thanks to Jim and Woody for the invitation to come and be with you. It's been quite enjoyable. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And why don't we move to our third presenter today? Now, following my pattern of waxing poetic about some of my favorite people, she's already nodding her head, please stop. But Melissa, I think of Melissa as the premier family mediator in the United States. I met her originally because she was doing work with the United States State Department, particularly on cross-border custody disputes. And I know that the United States Supreme Court has even referred cases to Melissa because of her prominence, particularly in the DC area, and her knowledge about some of these complex issues. But Melissa and I were recently collaborators on co-editing an issue of Family Court Review, which is the journal of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, about ODR and family mediation. And I joke with her, it's kind of like getting paired with the smartest girl in biology lab. You know you're going to get an A because she's going to do all the work. That's exactly what it was like. So I know I'm laying it on a little bit thick here, but I'm delighted to have my good friend Melissa to present from her perspective and her expertise. So Melissa, let me hand it to you.
Thank you so much. And I thank Colin for enduring all my nagging during all of the work we were doing for the Family Court Review on that issue, which will be coming out very soon. So I don't have a fancy PowerPoint, and actually I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible because everyone wants to hear Colin talk. I mean, that's why I'm here today, really. It's not to present my background or my experience in this topic. The topic that I'm specifically focused on is cross-jurisdictional issues when it comes to online dispute resolution. And that is a large focus of my personal and professional practice. And it is also the purpose that I'm involved in this particular project, in that I'm chairing the cross-jurisdictional subcommittee for Mediate.com when we're talking about online dispute resolution. And several of my subcommittee members have joined us today. And so I'm very grateful for them and their contributions that have yielded probably more questions than answers. And that's where I'll probably go from here, is that there are a lot of questions when we are sitting here talking about what cross-border or cross-jurisdictional disputes are. There's conflicts all throughout. There's conflicts in the laws between the jurisdictions, or even between what impacts the mediation or the mediator. There's conflicts in processes, standards, possibly credentialing, expectations between the parties, like Daniel was saying, the starting point, the technology. So it gets really complicated. And why is virtual, remote, online dispute resolution really a cross-jurisdictional issue? And my thought is it is for almost every single particular case. Even if you are sitting in California mediating for two other individuals who are on their computers in California, you are now sending information out there that could be bouncing off of servers or other technology in other jurisdictions that have different privacy laws, and there could be different cases in different jurisdictions and different courthouses. You could also be sitting at your vacation home in Nevada when you're mediating for two individuals, but you might be a California certified mediator and not one in Nevada. And does that have implications? So, when you get to a remote mediation situation, you are inherently going to be in a situation where there are going to be multi-jurisdictional issues. And I'm a lawyer mediator, and so that's where I get all of a sudden this anxiety in my chest about, are there potential ethical issues that I need to be considering to make sure I am not crossing any ethical boundaries as opposed to the jurisdictional boundaries? So some of the issues that we discussed as part of my subcommittee relate to the laws specifically, but the very first topics we were discussing is, how is it that the mediator can control a process when there might be multi-jurisdictions involved, such as Does the mediator have access to resources in the different locations where the different parties would be sitting for the mediation? Can the mediator control the process and ensure everyone's safety when they're having people sit in different countries or in different states? Does the mediator have an understanding or an appreciation for the different jurisdictions' laws when it comes to privacy, when it comes to use of technology, when it comes to confidentiality, when it comes to mandatory reporting of issues where there might be violence expressed during the mediation process? So all of these relate back to a mediator having to have certain advanced preparation and training to be able to even enter into the online mediation process when they're handling these type of cases. And of course, I deal with extraordinarily high conflict interpersonal disputes. So I often talk about it from that context. I realize that some of these issues might be more akin to those as opposed to, say, two lawyers mediating a dispute between corporations or something to that effect. So, when we're looking at multiple jurisdictions, we're looking at, are there court cases filed? Where is everyone physically sitting? Is everyone consenting to the process? And is the word consent even defined differently under the laws of the different jurisdictions that are implicated in this particular mediation? So what laws are actually defining this particular process? And how familiar must a mediator be with the laws of those different jurisdictions when they're defining what the process is at the very outset? Is an agreement to mediate, like Daniel was talking about, sufficient? And if so, does it need to incorporate information in there, even about what laws in what jurisdictions apply to the process and about the rules that would go forward afterwards, such as confidentiality? Mediation is not confidential in all jurisdictions, even though that is a fundamental principle that a lot of organizations and courts and whatnot do apply. But if you are doing a remote mediation with someone who's sitting in a jurisdiction where perhaps it is not a confidential process, or the laws in that jurisdiction do not define it as confidential, do you need to address that at the outset? And what is the exposure for the mediator or the individuals in the mediation to possibly have to disclose through some type of court or other process information that would otherwise be considered confidential in the sessions? Is the mediator even qualified to proceed if it's a multi-jurisdictional dispute, or if people are sitting in different jurisdictions that could be implicated? While in the US, as Leah was indicating, there's not necessarily formal, rigid certifications. Different courts have processes or, individual accreditation for mediators or quasi licensing of mediators. Different organizations spell out requirements for mediators that the mediators must meet in order to handle cases for those organizations. So if the standards, the ethics rules that the mediator is obligating themselves to abide by differ from the other jurisdiction, does that have an impact over what the mediator can and cannot do, how they define their role, and whether they're violating their own ethics rules or the other jurisdiction's ethics rules? And this arose more locally to me between a DC court mediation panel and a Virginia court mediation roster. There were, the pandemic, all the DC court mediators were starting to work from home, which could be in Virginia or in Maryland, where there were necessarily different ethics rules for handling mediation cases. And must the mediator who is sitting in Virginia handling a DC case abide by Virginia ethics rules or DC ethics rules? The issues were coming up, and the answers are not entirely clear, especially if you are mediating for an organization or a court where they have those, as Daniel was saying, one-page agreements to mediate that might not clarify those rules at the very beginning. I mentioned mandatory reporting laws. What happens if during a mediation session, someone threatens another person, but they're sitting in jurisdictions with which you are not familiar with the services? Maybe they're sitting in a different country or in a state across the country. How familiar do you need to be at the outset with where everyone is sitting, with where the laws are, what the laws are in all these jurisdictions, in order to ensure that your process has integrity and that everyone is safe where they may be? Are there issues related to electronic communication across borders, recording of individuals, audio or video of across borders, access by third parties, including the platform providers, whether or not a server is sitting in a different jurisdiction, the user agreements of these different technology platforms that we're using, and the privacy issues? To what extent do mediators need to be familiar with all of this before they undertake serving in this capacity as a remote or virtual mediator? What about even the legalistic issues? I had issues come up in a remote mediation just last year where people were in different countries. And the concern was that they had ongoing court cases in these different countries, but yet they had not effected proper service of the process of the legal documents on the other individual. Could people use mediation as a way almost to circumvent or abuse legal processes that might be going on in different jurisdictions, such as attempting to serve them using video mediation when some rules are relaxed in some jurisdictions? What about mediators who have dual roles, such as lawyer mediators like myself? There are some rigid ethics requirements for lawyer mediators in some of my jurisdictions, and in others of my jurisdictions, they're very different. So to what standard must I hold myself? It is the highest of all the standards from the 4 different jurisdictions where I'm licensed to practice law, or is it where I'm sitting that I have to abide by that standard? Does it matter if it's the case and there's a court case pending in a particular jurisdiction? Do I meet that jurisdiction standards, even if it's lower in the realm of what my ethical obligations might be as a lawyer mediator? So all of those could come into the play as to whether I might not be, stepping over some ethical lines. How about payment of fees for a mediator? I mean, this is a very practical issue, but it can be extraordinarily complicated because you're sending funds across borders, sometimes international borders. And some of my subcommittees suggested, well, can some mediators tax? Is there going to be that VAT tax, or is there a source of income issue, with OFAC and whether or not you can actually collect funds legally from an individual who might be sitting in a different country based on whether or not they're on some government list? So all of these cross-border issues have come up in significant discussions that my subcommittee has had. And the question is how do we address these issues? I mean, part of our outcome and our recommendations to mediate.com was it needs good training. The mediators, perhaps there is no good rule of thumb yet. Maybe there is no bilateral agreement or treaty or multi-jurisdictional law that would help impact or influence the credentialing and the standards and the ethics for mediators. But at least being able to spot that these are potential issues is extraordinarily vital for mediators, ensuring that they take on these mediation cases with their eyes wide open and that they are aware at each step from the outset when they bring on the case and onboard the potential clients all the way through to the very end that they're not doing anything that could violate any of their ethical obligations. And should there be standards, should there be laws written, not just aspirational goals or model rules? Should there actually be multi-jurisdictional laws that spell out more of this? Should there be just global networks of mediators who do cross-border mediation so that we can all share our experiences and have more impact in having these discussions, much like this forum, which is so valuable? Should we have better agreements to mediate? Should there be additional language incorporated into any document that we as mediators use in order to ensure that transparency at the very outset of our process, so everyone is starting from the same level playing field? Whether or not that agreement to mediate is going to be upheld in any court in any jurisdiction might be beside the point. It might be more about setting expectations from the very beginning. And then, of course, just training and issue spotting for mediators so that they're aware of what all of these potential pitfalls might be. So as you see that I asked a lot more questions that I think I could probably ever answer, but they're the questions that I think that have been coming up on the mind of a lot of individuals, even just state to state or even across international borders over the past year, but that probably should be discussed in more earnest among mediators who are handling these cases remotely, because it's just inevitable that the remote mediation will be multi-jurisdictional. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Yeah, I think one of the reasons why people gravitate towards standards is because they want to feel like by abiding by those standards, they don't have to consider all the complex questions that led to the creation of the standards in the first place. So it does me an enormous amount of good to know that someone with your focus and discipline and expertise is thinking through these questions and maybe distilling out some best practices that mediators can abide by so that they don't have to confront all of these complex multi-jurisdictional questions themselves. So does anyone have any thoughts or questions or reactions that they want to share with Melissa before I dive in here? I think this is meaty grist for the mill when we get back to the Q&A. So I'm going to try and go fast so we have as much time as possible for that. Okay, let me just share some slides and I'll share some thoughts. I know time is dwindling here. So if I click on the magic buttons, hopefully now you're looking at a slide that says standards, ethics, and new technology. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Any luck? Jim, do you see that?
It's up, Colin.
Okay, good. Great. So again, it's amazing to think that we have this forum and we have representatives from South Africa, we have representatives from Ireland, we have representatives from India, we have representatives from all over the world. I think it's amazing what technology has created. But Ethan Katch, who's the real father of online dispute resolution, I remember attending an ABA dispute resolution section meeting with him early in the aughts. And the presenter made the assertion in the session, we were both in the audience, that technology was going to solve all disputes and we weren't going to have any more disputes anymore because it was all going to get worked out by the code. And Ethan stood up and said, respectfully, sir, the power of technology to resolve disputes is dwarfed by the power of technology to generate new disputes. And I think that that's what it is. We have these incredible new capabilities that have presented themselves as a result of the integration of technology into the work that we do. And I think what you're hearing a lot about is some of the challenges in practice that are coming from that, and how can we as a field think systematically about these challenges and create standards, principles, and best practices that can provide guidance, particularly to new practitioners as to how they can navigate some of these minefields. So I'm actually cheating a little bit. I think there's a lot of presenters in these fora that have been showing their own great work and their own great analysis. I'm really sharing a lot of the great analysis that has come out of ICODR, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, which is a couple years old at this point. As Leah mentioned, it's a spin out from the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. And all of the work at ICODR, again, is built off the foundation of the scholarship that people like Leah and Dan have been doing for a decade or more. And I urge you to check out icodr.org. There's a lot of great free resources there. But one of the things that we do is all of our standards and best practices are freely available and downloadable. You can see we even have them in Arabic and Hebrew. I know we have a lot of friends from Brazil here. So if anybody wants to translate them into Portuguese, great, let's do it. Let's put them up there. But our goal is to aggregate a lot of this thinking, a lot of these best practices, and then to create these free guides. The first two that we did were on video mediation and video arbitration, sort of not standards so much as guidelines and best practices for practitioners who are trying to navigate the transition of their face-to-face service provision into the online environment. So, you know, you can check those out. But one of the main ones that we have, the green one there at the top, is very relevant to what we're talking about today. And these are standards that Dan's committee led within ICODR, because both Leah and Dan are board members and very active in ICODR, on ODR training standards. And I want to spend a moment just talking about that. Now, in the chat, we had a discussion pre-pandemic. The vision for online training, online mediation training, was very much take people who have already completed a face-to-face ADR training. So they already have expertise, or not expertise, but experience working with face-to-face mediation skills, and then say, okay, what are the challenges in trying to migrate those skills into the online environment? And you can see these training standards that we came up with. We say at the top, participants should receive face-to-face ADR training prior to or in combination with this training. So we saw this as almost like a 20-hour add-on to a 40-hour mediation training. And these are the topics that you would need to cover in order to essentially enable someone to take their offline mediation skills and migrate them online. Now, what we've said in the chat, which is so compelling, is now we're training people online first. So I think that gets more to this idea of a combination training, where it may be that, you know, we're exposing our trainees to these concepts for the first time in the online environment. And the first practice that they're going to have is video-based practice or text-based practice. So then we're thinking about, hey, well, maybe we do an online mediation training, and then later we could do a 20-hour add-on, which will help people migrate their online mediation skills to offline. So that's a really intriguing concept that I think the pandemic has thrust us into. But let me just take a minute to talk about what these components are that we've called out in what we call ODR trainings. And this gets back to what Jim was talking about. What is the difference between an ODR training and an online mediation training? So the main components we have, the first one is what is ODR, sort of the definition and basic techniques. And just talking about what ODR is, how did it come about? You know, what's the definition of ODR? What are the types of ODR? And we call out negotiation, mediation, evaluation, and then algorithmic resolutions, this concept of the fourth party, which is very foundational in ODR. We talk about different ODR communications types, because when you communicate face-to-face with parties, it's always synchronous and it's always in person. But online, you can communicate textually, which has asynchronous components to it, which can change the dynamics of a session. And you can see adapting offline ADR techniques to the online environment is a big part of that. And the other thing we talk a lot about is key ODR practitioner skills. And I'm going to revisit this from an ethics and standards perspective as well. What are the things that you need to know when you're providing online mediation services as opposed to face-to-face mediation services? So managing the technology, summarizing, balancing power differentials. A lot of these things are very similar when we talk about reframing communications, when we talk about active listening, but doing that online, obviously, there are some wrinkles. Another thing that we focus on is ethics, and we're going to talk about this in a minute because that's a lot of what iCoder is devoted to. But talking through the iCoder standards, looking at the ethical principles out of NCTDR, we talk a lot about diversity and cross-cultural communication and how that plays out online. Digital accessibility and accommodating party disabilities, that's a huge topic, particularly in online platforms. And then also party psychology. There's a lot of research that demonstrates that that people can behave differently online, and mediators need to understand some of those dynamics so that they can respond appropriately. We also talk a lot about best practices. You know, what have we found to be effective? Preparing for and conducting an online mediation and online arbitration, again, because we're talking about ODR writ large, which includes evaluative mechanisms. Dispute systems design, because when you're putting the technology together and selecting a platform, you're making choices about how you're going to fit the forum to the fuss. So we address that in these trainings. We also talk about ensuring ongoing quality in ODR, creating feedback loops so the systems are constantly improving. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as well. This is very important: privacy, security, data protection, and legal issues. And those are much more prominent concerns in online practice than face-to-face. And the last thing, and this was called out again in the chat, is practice. Fundamentally, what this is about is putting the people in the chair of the mediator and saying, okay, let's do a video simulation. Let's do an audio simulation. Let's do a text-based simulation. What issues did you identify? What are the differences in the dynamics between the parties in using these different platforms? Let them try the technologies. And again, when we first started out doing these trainings and when the pandemic first hit, everyone was like, well, how do I use Zoom? How do I do breakout rooms? How do I ensure the platform is secure? Well, people have pretty much gotten that down now. People are very comfortable with Zoom, but Zoom is not the extent of ODR. So looking at other tools and figuring out, how do you do joint document editing? How do you use structured form-based information gathering to help people make sure that their negotiation is pointed in the right direction? And also managing party expectations and encouraging participation, because it's very easy for people to drop out or stonewall online. So these, as I said, these components, they're available on the iCoder website. You can download them. They're freely available. And we at mediate.com, as we've done our trainings, training people on online mediation, we ensure that we adhere to these. I think that the standards, I've been part of many standard setting initiatives over the last 20, 30 years. And I think it's very rare that standards have so much enforcement power that people follow them to the letter of the law. I think that standards actually do a better job nudging practice in the right direction. And that's what I think iCoder is currently doing. We don't have any enforcement power at iCoder currently, but we do have thought leadership, and we do have, I think, some influence in terms of issuing these best practices because people are paying attention to us. So that's sort of what we thought of as table stakes for an ODR training, which would complement someone who has face-to-face mediation experience already. Now, let me talk a little bit more about iCoder's ethical standards, which are also available on the iCoder website. And as I said, there are hundreds of pages, if not thousands of pages of scholarship and theory talking about what are the principles that should undergird effective dispute resolution practice and online dispute resolution practice. Our goal at iCoder was to take all of this complex thought and scholarship and distill it down to a set of ethical standards that you could put on a card, or inside a matchbook, something that is relatively measurable, fairly intelligible and straightforward, but also something that someone could say, I want to abide by these standards. And this is something that I'm going to commit to. And that's what iCoder members commit to. So these are the iCoder standards. And again, they're the product of a lot of wordsmithing. I'm not going to go through each one, although there are some very interesting wrinkles. But for an example, let me talk about number one, accessibility. Now, we all think we know what accessibility means. It just needs to be easy for people to find the process. But there's other elements of accessibility that, when you think about it a little bit deeper, for instance, it should be available through both mobile and desktop channels, because we can't make an assumption that everybody has a fancy laptop or a broadband internet connection. So that's a kind of accessibility that matters online. Cost is also another huge issue. You can build a beautiful, fair online dispute resolution process, but you have to charge $1,000 to file a case. And that creates a huge barrier to accessibility. And another area that is very important is the platform must be easily accessed by people with different physical ability levels. And people don't necessarily think of that when they think of accessibility. They just hear the term. But that's a very important ethical consideration for people in designing ODR systems. Are you sure that your parties, no matter what their physical ability levels, will be able to easily access the platform and benefit from it? So there are many things that are built into each of these terms. But when we talk about accessibility, confidentiality, legality, security, equality, fairness, impartiality, and neutrality, and then transparency. Now, some of these ethical standards you may sense are in tension with each other. If we talk about security and we talk about transparency, well, how can you optimize on both of those terms? Well, we make clear in the description that transparency is usually about the process and security is more about personally identifiable information. But I think it is important to train and work with our trainees on these standards and talk through the ramifications of each. And there are a lot of ways that we do that. Now, I found the most effective way to talk about ethical standards in trainings is often to put people in dilemmas and say, what do you think? And I'll show you an example of one of those dilemmas that we share. But I do want to do a deep dive into one issue that I think is particularly complex, and we have not spent enough time thinking about it and talking about it in the field. And that is, here's an example, ODR practice dilemma, for instance. And when you take face-to-face mediators, it's very easy to put them into an ethical dilemma that emerges in an online situation because these dynamics don't exist in a face-to-face. So this is a dilemma where you're mediating between two business partners and there's a lack of progress and you're getting frustrated and you're waiting for one of them to respond online, and just absent-mindedly you enter one of the parties' names into Google. And you find out they've been fined for financial fraud in prior businesses. Now, the parties have never shared this with you. You didn't know this information, and now you know this. So what do you do? How do you deal with your own issues around fairness? Can you continue to perform impartial mediation services in this case now that you know this information? Should you disclose to the parties that you discovered it? What if the other party doesn't know this information? Or what if they made the decision not to tell you? How are they going to feel the fact that you're Googling them and you're finding this? Now, in a face-to-face process, this is less of an issue, because if the parties are stonewalling, you're not going to pull out your phone and just start Googling them. But online, this is the kind of thing, if you don't train a mediator to say, you need to be careful about this, particularly in the middle of a process, they can make a mistake like this and it can really put them into a difficult ethical scenario. So I'm not saying that there's a clear answer as to what you should do in this circumstance, but I think it's a very interesting thing to do in the context of a training, is to put people into these online ethical dilemmas and talk through, because that's what can prevent them. And it's funny, when I do this scenario with family mediators, I find all of the family mediators, the majority of experienced family mediators, tell me they do Google their parties, but they don't do it in the middle of the case. They do it before they take the case, because they feel it's incumbent upon them. It's one of their responsibilities to know kind of what they're getting into. Whereas most of my commercial and transactional mediators, when I do this scenario, they say, I never do any background research on my parties. I only deal with what they bring into the room. It's not my place to go bring external information into the case that the parties don't bring in. So again, this gets to what Dan was talking about. There are different forms of mediation, and there may be different standards and ethical standards that are brought expectations into each particular type of case. So let me just deep dive into one area that I think is very important, that we in the field need to spend a lot of time thinking about and addressing in our trainings for online mediators. And let me see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up as quickly as I can because I want to get to the Q&A. This gets to security. Now, these are the 3 ICODER ethical standards that deal with what we would call security. Now, different people call this in different things. In mediation, we often talk about that as confidentiality. In Silicon Valley, we talk about that as security or privacy. And then we also talk about transparency in terms of procedural justice. As I said, these things are not all the same, but they're related. And we have ethical obligations. You know, most mediators, when you finish a face-to-face training, or if you go through a dispute resolution graduate program, they'll come out telling you one of the prime ethical obligations for a mediator is to preserve the confidentiality of the private information of the parties. But that norm is changing online. I've built online dispute resolution systems where there's complete transparency. For instance, the ICANN domain name dispute resolution program is completely transparent. Every case that's filed is publicly available. You know the exact names of the parties. You know exactly the issues that were filed in the case, and it's shared across the internet. So again, we have to think about these norms when we fit the forum to the fuss. When we do our dispute systems design, we have to balance all of these priorities. But one of the things that is very important is making sure that our mediators are using tools, technology that live up to their ethical obligations as online service providers. And what I see across the field, across the world, is that mediators are currently using these kinds of tools to work with their parties: email, calendar invitations, Word docs, Skype calls, WhatsApp calls, Google Docs, text messages, social media. I see all this playing out through all of these channels. And why is that? Well, these are very convenient tools. We use them every day. So wouldn't we just integrate them into our mediation practices? But the problem is, as a nerd and a technologist, all of these tools have very significant security concerns, very significant concerns. And if we say we're going to take the security and confidentiality of our parties' information seriously, we can't just cavalierly use these tools and not take steps to ensure that we're abiding by those ethical obligations. Now, again, when we're meeting face-to-face with the parties in a room, you know, and we're sitting there across the table, we don't really have to worry about listening devices, you know, in the conference room that may be capturing this information and sharing it with other parties. But when we're working online, we have to pay a lot of attention to that. So what I would say, for instance, email is a highly insecure channel for information communication. And emails travel across networks and servers before arriving at their audience's inbox. They're not encrypted. Servers can hold emails that are decades old. You know, if you have a Yahoo account that you've had for 10 years and it's got a ton of emails in there, if somebody gets your password, they can get emails from 5, 6, 7 years ago. And there may be confidential information from disputes that are long closed in that information. Also, emails don't just go to your computer now. They go to your phone, they go to your refrigerator, they go all over the place, and any of those devices can get compromised. The other thing is, if I send sensitive information to my friend Harry, and Harry forwards that to someone else, says, hey, look at this, that person could then forward it to 1,000 other people. And Harry doesn't know that, and I don't know that. So again, that's another challenge of email security. If we say we're going to take the confidentiality of our party's information seriously, I think there's a strong argument that we cannot use email to communicate that information because it is so insecure. And we cannot guarantee to our parties that we're protecting their information across its entire chain. So that's why you see a lot of ODR platforms migrating to these secure text-based communications platforms. You can send an email to the parties that say, hey, you have a new message, but then they have to log into a platform with a password, preferably even with two-factor authentication, to ensure the only people that can see that information are the people who have the right to see it. And instead of emailing attachments all over the place with Word docs and receipts and Excel spreadsheets, that should be put in an online secure environment that's password protected, because that's how you can say we are taking our obligations around protecting your information seriously. So this is just one example of the kind of things we have to address in an online mediation training that we don't have to address when we do face-to-face mediation trainings, but it's very important that we do so. Another example is video conferencing. You know, this is a great event. It's amazing how everyone dialed in. We can all interact with each other. I just saw that one of the parties shared their screen, perhaps accidentally, but that's another example. Who has access? A mediation should not be run as openly as we've run this Zoom today, which is an open forum for people from all around the world. We have to say who has access, who is recording it, who is visible. And Zoom obviously is one platform, but there are many platforms, from WhatsApp to FaceTime to you know, WebEx to GoToMeeting. It's hard to keep track of all of them. Different Microsoft Teams, and who knows, are those software products, are they recording that information? Who has access to it? So it's very important that we think through these tools and evaluate them against our ethical standards in the field. And it may be that we need to build our own tools that abide by our ethical standards, because these open tools were not constructed to live up to our high standards. So, and again, I'm not going to get into all of the things that you can train a mediator on, but there are ways to secure each of these communications channels. And if we don't address that with our trainees, then they're going to go out and they're probably going to use tools that don't live up to those ethical obligations. And we may have a circumstance in the future where in a mediation or in an arbitration, someone does not use secure tools and that information is compromised, and it's going to be a black mark on the field as a whole. And we need to anticipate that issue and be preventative and proactive in training and building tools and providing those tools to our trainees to ensure that that bad outcome doesn't occur. Okay, so the other thing is iCoder is working on a set of ODR security guidelines, so stay tuned. But again, we're going to put out a document that represents these best practices, and then hopefully those will be integrated into trainings around the world. But this is an example of how iCoder works and how we're trying to anticipate some of these issues and get ahead of them. So I'm not going to talk about security steps or best practices. I will say, this gets back to what Jim was saying, there is so much that is coming that we have to prepare for. If you think about smart contracts and blockchain and machine learning and AI and this whole concept of decentralized justice, there's a lot. That the transformations we've seen over the last 20 years have been profoundly disruptive. I think the transformations that are coming over the next 20 years with quantum computing and all of these things are going to be even more disruptive. So that's why it's so important that we build institutions and think about these questions so we can anticipate some of these changes and get ahead of them. So, because I think you can't unring the bell. If you start to see technologies adopted at scale and utilized at scale by mediators around the world, and then later we identify security concerns or ethical concerns, it's going to be very difficult to rein that back in. So that's why we want to be anticipatory in taking some of these actions. So Jim shared a lot of great questions, registrant questions, and I want to get to the Q&A. We can't answer all of them. I do think the good news is the majority of these topics have been addressed in the prior presentations. I will address one on the list. How can we best stay current with ongoing mediation innovation? And I think that's really important. It's not about where the technology is today. It's about where all of this is going. And that's why we have to constantly be updating these standards, having this conversation in an ongoing way. And that's what iCoder is devoted to, as well as monitoring all these changes and then updating these standards over time. Because you can't presume that if we develop standards for the way the world is today, that's going to be relevant in 5 or 10 years. That's what we've already seen, because the standards that we had didn't anticipate this rapid emergence of technology. And I think I might share some of this with my fellow panelists in the Q&A in terms of measuring the effectiveness around online mediations, diversity and inclusion, and how we can ensure quality, and what systems shouldn't put in place. Even if we don't have enforcement power for these ethical standards, what systems could we implement? But I do want to open it up for the discussion in Q&A, so I'm actually going to stop it there. And let me open it up and see first from my fellow panelists if Leah, Dan, and Melissa, do you have any comments or anything in the wake of my presentation or some of the other things that have been addressed that you'd like to share before we cast a wider net for questions?
I'll say one quick thing, and that is that I think that the engagement that Catherine from Canada stimulated, that Colin picked up upon, that she brought to the chat about the fact that some of us started to train online because of the pandemic. And so then we think, okay, people who are already trained in person, what new do we need to teach them about online? And now we suddenly have, as some countries are opening up, at least hopefully long-term or temporarily, and we have people trained online going offline now. Are there new ethical dilemmas we need to speak to them about, new practice techniques? To me, the fantastic questions, and to me, what that speaks to is that the field is dynamic. That technology is changing, but also our circumstances are changing. And therefore, that's why I say, let's keep this conversation going. Let's make it more international than it even is about standards and best practices. And I would encourage people, whenever there isn't a standard that speaks to what you need to address, consider going above, the 300,000 feet above, to ethical principles, because they can provide guidance. So I put the link to the ethical principles, and as well as a link to ODR provider list. The National Center is not endorsing any of these, but we're trying to keep a record of those that are offering services, platforms, and tools. And then I also gave the link to the standards. So let's keep this conversation going. We need everyone involved.
Absolutely.
If I could just drop in a quick word also.
Please.
Colin, your comments about, especially about privacy, confidentiality, security, are on the money. I think one of the things we're seeing that we hadn't seen, say, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, is there are beginning to be more and more bespoke systems for online dispute resolution, systems that are created to do dispute resolution. And those systems generally, not always, but generally address the notion of security, encryption, et cetera, reasonably well. Sometimes there are some problems, but mostly they at least address the issues. Whether they do it well or not, we can argue. I don't think what's going to happen is I don't think we're going to stop mediators, arbitrators, facilitators, and other people around the world who work in third-party work. We're not going to stop them from using non-bespoke technology. They're going to continue to use the emails and the Zooms and the WhatsApps of the world. And sometimes that's not a bad thing, because depending on what kind of information you're dealing with, okay, maybe that's all right. What I think it says to me is that as educators and trainers, we need to at least include the idea of how one evaluates what the real risk is in using those technologies, because we're not going to stop people from using them. So we at least should be helping teach them to use them safely and appropriately.
One of the things that Leah spoke to, and I think you'll see this in the iCoder documents, is that standards often provide a floor. Like these are the things that everybody should do. We believe all online mediators should do these things when they do an online video-based mediation. But then we also have best practices, which I think creates sort of a North Star. It's like if you could do all of these things, that would be even better. And I think that's what I mean in terms of standards initiatives providing a nudge to the field to say, like, this is a better way to go. I agree with you, Dan. iCoder has no enforcement power to run around and say to mediators, you can't use email, or you don't have virus protection on your computer. So, if somebody compromises your computer and accesses all of the information from the parties you're mediating, that's going to be your fault. We have no teeth necessarily in the organization, but we can go out and say, look, these are concerns, and here are ways that you can address these concerns. It makes me think also what Melissa was talking about with the cross-jurisdictional issues. If I'm an individual mediator, I can't navigate this morass. It's too complex. But if there's an organization or a committee that sat down and they've thought through these things and they said, look, these are the 10 things that you should do, and it'll help to ensure that you're not going to go afoul of some of these potential sand traps. I think that's really what practitioners are looking for. And I think that may, in a sense, be the most beneficial outcome from all of these fora that are being hosted, is creating that set of best practices that can nudge practice in the right direction.
Well, I think also, Colin, to go back to one of Leah's comments, you follow rules and laws because you get whacked on the wrist if you don't follow them. People follow standards, generally speaking, around the world, from ISO on down. They follow standards because they make sense and they work, right? they do something for you. If you follow those, they do something for you. That is, they keep you, in the boundaries, so to speak. But people use them because they make sense and they work. And that's what we're trying to aim at in all the work that we're doing. Fitting it to our profession and saying, hey, these things work. They're helpful for you.
The other comment I'll make before I go to Melissa is what Leah said is the flexibility of the field is a huge asset in ADR. I've done a lot of work in the courts, and the challenge with the courts is those processes are very rigid and it's very difficult to change. It's not made to innovate and be flexible. So as technology disrupts the world, the courts are having a very hard time staying relevant. Whereas we in the dispute resolution field, I think, our watchword has always been flexibility and responsiveness. So I think that's one of the reasons why we need to design these systems so that they can be constantly self-updating and self-editing, because that can keep us more relevant even in an environment of rapid change. So Melissa, I want to give you an opportunity to speak.
No, I mean, I don't disagree that standards are a wonderful tool to move forward in our discussions to meet our ethical obligations. I know at least there have been some discussions from cross-border family mediators or international family mediators about creating some type of general consensus or standards. And it was extraordinarily hard to do that among so many different mediation cultures and rules and processes throughout the world. And what we discussed in terms of international family mediation often was it made more sense to do regional work because it was more easy to harmonize practices or rules within a region than it was globally, and that then the regions could be represented perhaps in some type of global network. So, I mean, that's where, at least on the family law spectrum, standards were coming down.
Absolutely. Well, I know we only have 8 minutes left. Does anyone want to make a comment? You could use the raise hand function, or you could just unmute yourself. We had a lot of great comments in the chat as well that we could surface. I just want to see if we have an opportunity for input from our broad audience here. Well, I will take the initiative to go back to the questions that Jim surfaced, and maybe I'll take my prerogative to ask this question, particularly of Leah. One of the questions Jim asked was, what measurement is best used to determine the effectiveness of online mediation programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion? I think it's a tricky thing to do that kind of measurement. I think it also gets to this last question in terms of quality assurance systems. How could we go out and evaluate, just like the list that you shared, Leah, from NCTDR of all the different providers? What is a way for us to go and kind of use a yardstick to look at programs and evaluate their effectiveness in not only these ethical standards, but also some of the things that we talk about in the ethical standards, like equality, impartiality, neutrality, things like that. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that topic.
I'll mention two things. One is, I actually think that if we take that work on as individuals, then we bring that lens with us. So, for example, if you do work on yourself regarding inequality, diversity, inclusion, whatever are the challenges in the country or the culture in which you're working and you're living, I think that the more work you do on the self, then you bring that lens with you, so that lens will already be with you when you think about accessibility and language accessibility and people with disabilities as you're choosing platforms. So my first suggestion, doing a tremendous amount of work on this myself, on myself and also in the field, that would be my very first suggestion, is do the work on yourself, and then you can bring that lens with you. Another suggestion is, I think that only focusing on ourselves is insufficient. And I think we need to think about systems. So when we think about systems design, or who's getting paid to train, who are our trainers, what cultural lens they come from, if we bring the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to our systems, that's very important. And then lastly, if I could share the screen for just a moment. My quick response is, if you go to odr.info and look up the ethical principles, This is just on ODR, but I still hope that it will help prompt your thinking if you're not using technology. The principles around accessibility, around empowerment and equality will hopefully give you some prompting that you could think about as you're choosing your process, your training partner, the way you're designing intake, your intake forms, etc. And lastly, I would say these are not boxes to be checked. Instead, they actually have relationships with each other. And I think Colin explained that really well when he talked about transparency, confidentiality, and security. The same thing here. Empowerment is related to equality, fairness, and accessibility. And they sometimes are in, all of these principles are in tension with each other, but sometimes they feed each other in this kind of interrelated way. So I hope with the brief moment that I have to speak to that those are some useful suggestions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other point that I want to echo is what Dan said in his presentation is, the software doesn't put its hand up while you're programming it and say, hey, we may be introducing bias here, but I do think that we need to come up with ethical standards, not only for the mediators and arbitrators that may be delivering these services, but also for the platform designers and the coders and the algorithm designers, and even the people who are feeding the data into the AIs in terms of the data set that they create. This is not something that we've had to think about in the past, but as the fourth party plays a more prominent role in our work moving forward, we have to train that fourth party. We have to take the responsibility because it will not monitor its ethical standards itself. We as the third party have the responsibility for monitoring the ethics of the fourth party. So
Colin, can I react really quickly to something that's in the chat box?
please.
Yeah, there was the question and it just rolled out of my sight. Let me get it back down. Do you think ODR trained professionals who work with court annexed and operated ADR programs should be recognized by the courts as having enhanced knowledge over those who haven't taken such training? This might not be a popular opinion, but I say absolutely yes. One of the things that drives me crazy, for example, in my home state of Virginia, the Virginia Supreme Court, when we hit the pandemic, wanted to supply mediators to work online with parties across the state. Their entire vetting process was to send out a note to all the mediators who are working in the court saying, are you comfortable working online? If you said yes, your name went on a list and you were now an ODR mediator. Made me crazy. And so I do think there is a reason why we recommend training that is specific to the work online, and I really think they should be recognized. So my answer to your question is yes, absolutely.
Well, this is great. This conversation obviously could continue, but I want to respect everyone's time here. Thank you for a wonderful session. Thank you to my co-presenters. Thank you to Woody and Jim for taking this initiative. Let me hand it back to you, Jim, to help wrap us up.
Actually, Woody, any closing thoughts from you?
Well, my first thought is I wish we could all actually now be in person, have a nice cappuccino, and discuss together these incredibly stimulating thoughts. Colin did it again. I took from his presentation the thought that we had to nudge the practice in the right direction. That is actually the goal that Jim and I have for the task force. We're not attempting to rewrite standards. We want a conversation stimulated by the best thinkers in the field, which we had today, to look at some of the boundaries, just like Dan said. Any good mediator has a struggle with boundaries, and it's a journey that we all have to deal with. And what Dan did is took it up one level of abstraction and said, that's what we have to do as a field. And when we looked finally at the idea of systems, as Leah brilliantly talked about, and are we as mediators the tech consultants of the session? I think any of us who've conducted sessions struggle with that on a daily basis. So this is not the end, it's the beginning of a great discussion.
Beautiful. I'll be as brief as I can. I was going to start my comments by saying that online mediation is not neurosurgery. But after this presentation, it was kind of sounding a little bit like that. And I thought we really got a sense of just how complex and challenging many of the issues, in fact, can be. Nonetheless, mediation, if it's mediation, I think remains voluntary, that a participant should be able to leave at any time for any reason or no reason. Presumably, if they don't agree, they're kind of left with what they had, before they came in, that hopefully there's a concept of do no harm. They could, of course, that they're supported by mediation confidentiality, even if not perfect. There's the ability to substitute a mediator if the one hired isn't working, and people can always mediate at another time as well. So I'm mentioning just some of these things because I do think that the voluntariness and confidentiality built into the essence of mediation does provide certain fundamental safeties. But I also think that online mediation highlights the criticality of transparency and disclosure, because the concept is that well-informed disputants can protect themselves. And while ethically we may or may not want to Google them, I promise you, they have Googled you. They have Googled you. So think about that. I just can't tell you how wonderful I find Dan, the developed, and Leah as well, the developed universal code of disclosure, or some such animal, if you will, that really boils things down to their essence, that can be used in a wide variety of environments. And most importantly, that it's relatively simple and straightforward, because we can lose our participants in complexity, I think. And I love what iCoder is doing, also boiling down the issues to their real essence, so that not only is it helpful to us, but I think it's helpful for our consumers and participants out there. I do look forward to developing these kind of tools and resources, because I fear if we look, for example, at the issue of mediation or mediator confidentiality over the years, that issue, certification or not, and how, and in all this, drew so much energy of our field. I used to just call it the endless contemplation of the field's navel. And that so focused on these issues, for example, of qualification, robbed us of our energy in being able to really direct our mediation offering to the broader world. So I'm really looking for tools and consolidations and universal disclosures and iCoder standards and the like, that not only really do an integrous, capable job on the substantive issues, but are usable as we're communicating to the broader world. Finally, next Friday, we have another forum, the fourth in our series, this one being on experiential training, mentorship, and case consultation. It will be at the same time, but there will be a different Zoom link that will get to everybody approximately 3 days in advance. Do note again that evaluation and comment form that's been in the chat and is also on the main forum webpage. And from me, that's everything. Anybody else with any final closing comments? We'll have this recorded forum up, I'm guessing, in about 24 hours. We'll let you know about that as well. Thank you so much for taking part, everybody.